care of the dying, care of their families, right? And how the Civil War, and particularly Antietam, changed practices of medicine and death in the United States. So that's our theme for today, and it's very cheerful. But hopefully there'll be something in here that at least is interesting and intriguing, if not maybe happy, that you've never heard before. So I found this description from George Templeton Strong, who is a prominent diarist from New York, wrote about everything he saw, was very involved in local politics, and was an officer in the United States Sanitary Commission, which was very involved in providing medical care to the soldiers. And so he was on the ground in Antietam a week after the battle and described the atmosphere pervaded by the scent of the battlefield, by the scent of death. Right, the field was he saw the trenches where the men had been buried in long fields. He saw the horses that had not yet been buried, and also the shot marks and the cannon marks throughout the village. So you get this picture of what it looked and felt like to go into this place. And I will say, there's a lot of really gruesome pictures of this, and particularly gruesome stories of what happened, and I've included a few things, but not a lot. And I've tried to avoid some of the most horrific, because I didn't really feel we needed them plastered up here. But just to sort of set the scene, right, of that aftermath, right? And part of why McClellan stayed on the battlefield was to care for the wounded and bury the dead, right? That was important. It was important for the morale of the men who survived, that they could see that their comrades were being taken care of, right? So when Lincoln visited McClellan twice, once 2 weeks after the battle, at which point he felt it was totally appropriate that they were still there and preparing for the next step, but also taking care of the people who needed to be taken care of. When McClellan's still there 2 months after the battle, that's where Lincoln has a problem. Right? What's really unique about Antietam at this moment in time is that the photographers show up. One in particular, a man named Alexander Gardner. Gardner worked for the most prominent photography studio in the United States. A man named Matthew Brady had pioneered the American use of wet plate, glass plate photography. So photography had been around since the 1830s, 1840s, but prior versions of photography, the earliest versions of it, were very difficult, very expensive to do. And some European photographers figured out a new method in 1856 with glass plates and wet chemicals that very quickly transferred an image and created a negative, which meant you could reprint the image multiple times. Right? So this is very new technology at the start of the Civil War. It's only a couple of years old, and Brady had set up a studio in New York City in 1857 that was extremely popular, and he sort of franchised his name and his approach and set up a couple other studios in 1860, one of which was in Washington, D.C., under the leadership of Alexander Gardner. And as all of these troops start coming through Washington, D.C. at the start of the war, they stop and have their picture taken. Right? So Brady and Gardner and the Brady studio become this really well-known thing very early on because the wet plate photography makes it more accessible. Right? It's more within the means of, if not a poor person, an average person, to go and have a photograph taken for an important thing, like I'm going off to war and I want to be able to send my family a picture, right? So that they can remember me if something happens. So now there's this opportunity to show people what a battle might look like. Right? You can't photograph an actual battle. 2 reasons why. First of all, the photography needs a very long exposure. Right? So you can't really photograph motion of any sort. It gets very blurry. A lot of the chemicals involved were also highly flammable, so you wouldn't want them around gunfire. So you're not going to photograph the actual battle, but you can go to the battlefield. Right? And now we have this battlefield that is in a location that is firmly within United States control. Right? There's no chance anymore that Antietam is going to be taken back by the Confederates. It wasn't Confederate territory to begin with. So Brady suggests to Alexander Gardner that he go to Antietam and photograph what the aftermath of the battle looks like. And he is there 2 days later. One of the things he had done was figure out how to make a mobile darkroom. So this picture, which again is Burnside's Bridge, is also, there's a little cart here, and that's his portable darkroom in the cart that he can take and photograph and then develop that wet plate so that it can be used as a negative over and over again. So he does that. He goes to Antietam and he sets up and he starts photographing the landscape, photographing the dead who are still in the process of being buried, because again, it's 2 days. Right? We know, both at Antietam and Gettysburg, where Gardner did this, that there's some staging involved. Right? That sometimes he photographed exactly what he saw, and other times he moved bodies around and propped things up for the best possible effect. Right? So it's not exactly what it looked like. But also, there would have been some movement already, perhaps, of bodies being moved into position to be buried. Right? So some of what he's showing is the human aftermath of the war, right? The grave diggers setting up to make the burial trench and put the bodies into it. Which was already not where people had fallen when they died. Right? The next step, though, is the dissemination of these photographs, and that's really what takes over everything. Right? So a month after he takes the photographs, Gardner brings them to New York, and Brady holds an exhibit in a gallery in New York City called The Dead of Antietam. Right? And he puts 70 of these photographs on display. And then he turns them into stereographs. You remember what a stereograph is? Right? You've all seen those. Incredibly popular 19th century middle class parlor entertainment, something to entertain your children. You look at the picture, 2 versions of the picture, through the mirrors and the images, it looks 3D. So he sells a bunch of them as stereograph cards. He creates woodcut images so they can be widely reprinted in the newspapers. And so for the first time in late October and into November 1862, right, people who live nowhere near a battlefield can see the aftermath of a battle, right, in their papers, in their galleries, in their homes, in a way that was just unimaginable before. So it's this technological moment in time that makes this possible, right? And the New York Times said, if he had not brought the bodies and laid them at our doorsteps, he had done something very like it. Right? He drove it home in a way that people couldn't imagine, right, before seeing it, before seeing what that meant. But here's a question. 19th century Americans were not unaccustomed to seeing death. Right? The infant mortality rate was falling at that time, but it was still quite high. Right? So chances are, if you were a family that had children, you had lost a child. Right? Women still died in childbirth on a regular basis. People still died of diseases on a regular basis. And people mostly died at home. People lived in multi-generational households. Older people died on their family farm and then were buried in the family plot on the farm. Right? So dead bodies were not unusual things for people to see. So what is different about seeing it like this? What is going on that's so different about this dying, right? There's a couple of things, but does anyone have any instant thoughts? Like what's going on that is so shocking?
Lots and lots and lots of piles.
Yeah, so the volume is part of it. The volume and the piling, the sense that these are bodies not being treated as people. Right? that people are seeing the dead of the war in a heap rather than in a nice coffin, like you might expect to see them, right? And it's one of the reasons why the US government will very strictly control the imagery of dead bodies that can be seen in most future wars. Because anything that looks like the dehumanization of the soldiers is very upsetting to people. Anything else? Why is this so different?
They weren't laid out like you normally would see. One of the first things that happened to be body
Yeah.
laid out very carefully, dressed in a shroud or something. These were not.
Yeah. So I mean, it's the physical vision of what you're seeing is much more gruesome than if somebody dies of dysentery, which is still a really unpleasant way to die. But it looks much more awful, and then the person has not been cared for by their family and prepared for burial, and they haven't had that experience, right? And early on, the scale of death was small enough that the army could put everyone in a pine box before they buried them. And at Antietam, they just dig trenches and put the bodies in because there's no way to bury that many people quickly enough if they have to wait and make a coffin for everyone. So the sense of what people thought death should look like was just completely rattled by this. So we have to talk a little bit more about what the people at the time would have considered a good death to look like, and also what they considered appropriate medical care. Right? The first thing is that only poor people, really poor people, people with no family and no resources and no sort of community would ever go to a hospital or die in a hospital before the Civil War. Right? If you were sick, you were cared for at home. The only people who would be in a hospital are people who had no one who was willing to take care of them. Right? And so the expectation of if you got sick and died is you would be surrounded by your loved ones who took care of you, who made sure you had a calm and pleasant place to the best of their ability. Right? And this is very important for middle class people in particular. Right? But even people with fewer resources are invested in making sure that their family members are taken care of to the extent they can. And the room where they're in is as comfortable as possible, and family come and visit, and you talk, and a good death is very calm and orderly, and the person who's dying has a chance to pass on messages to all of their loved ones and make it very clear that they have a sense that they are moving on to heaven where everyone will be reunited. So part of this is really seeped in the Second Great Awakening and the evangelical Protestantism of the time that's very focused on a personal relationship with God, a personal sense of having been saved, and a sense that, and a belief in the literal resurrection, a very literal belief in the resurrection of the body of all people at some point in time in the future. And so your body that is calmly preserved and taken care of to the best of everyone's ability will someday come back to you, and you'll be reunited with all your loved ones. Right? So it's very important that people have this sort of death and then are very quickly interred in their community cemetery, whether it's their church, their home, their town, close to home, where their family can come see them on a regular basis. Right? And there's a whole movement at the same time to build city cemetery, like municipal cemeteries, but slightly outside the city limits, on a hillside near a river with a beautiful park-like setting where people would want to go and spend time and visit. And it is not seen as in any way irreverent to take a picnic with you and have your Sunday luncheon meal after church with your loved ones in the cemetery. That's appropriate because the cemetery has been created as this sort of public space for community interaction, and the community extends to the people who have gone on already. So The Civil War just shatters any possibility of most of that happening, right? These people are dying far away from home. Men are dying suddenly in horrific and gruesome ways where they can't make a last profession of faith. They can't send messages home to their loved ones. And even if they're wounded and die in the hospital is not seen as a place where somebody of a good middle-class Christian family should die. That's just as bad as far as most Victorian Americans are concerned, right? Their mothers and sisters can't collect their hair to make mourning jewelry. That's what this is. It's a very common practice of taking hair of loved ones and braiding it. This is loosely. Sometimes they braid it so tightly you can't actually tell what it is, and make a brooch or a ring or a necklace. And that's the only appropriate jewelry to wear while you're in mourning, right? Other than your wedding ring. But that can't be done if your son dies hundreds of miles away on a battlefield and is put in a trench. Right? So the Civil War just disrupts everything about what people thought death should look like. Right? You can't, I didn't, again, making choices about what types of pictures to show you and what types of pictures not to. There is a very common practice among people of means in the 19th century to take post-mortem photographs, photographs of their loved ones, particularly dead children. Right? So if your child dies at birth or later on, right, and you'll take pictures of them, sometimes there's some that are really, really, really strange looking. I mean, the whole concept seems strange to us, but some of these pictures, like the mother is sitting in a chair covered with a black cloth so that it looks like, so that you can pretend she's not there, and she's holding the dead toddler, right, on her lap, and the rest of the children are sitting around. The live children are also in the photograph so that the dead child is still part of the family, right? And these are treasured family relics. And then there's they figure out this way to make some of these images look half developed, essentially, with the older technology that they had before the wet plates and the glass plates, where you could make the dead person slightly ghostly, right, and transparent in the way the photograph was printed. So there's a whole tradition of this that, is not accessible to many people, but is very common among sort of the well-to-do middle class, that this is how you remember and memorialize your dead relatives and keep them part of your family, is to take these photographs of them. And you can't do that, again, if they're dying, on the battlefield. And so all of the rituals of death are gone, and you have to create new ones or try to figure out how to implant some of this onto the situation. So when we talk about sort of the official response of caring for the dead, the dying, and the wounded, a couple things I want to clear up, questions that very frequently come up. So when it comes to antebellum medical care, most American practitioners of medicine were very poorly trained. Why is that? There's two reasons. One is the Second Great Awakening. Right? The idea that the physical body needed to be preserved so that because the person's soul was going to be reunited with it at some point in the future, right, meant that practices like autopsies were really seen as horrible, right? Cadavers, the best way to learn to be a doctor is to study anatomy, right? And often that means studying cadavers, studying people who've said, I want my body to be studied and sort of donated, right? It was very hard. It was seen as highly immoral to do that in much of the United States in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s. So it's hard for doctors to get the kinds of training that we normally would expect them to have. It's also seen as highly improper for men to look at female bodies. right? So it's really hard to get any sort of functional medical care if you're a woman. And it's seen as highly improper for women to be trained in medicine, although there were a few, right? There's a couple ways people get around this, right? So most notoriously is using slaves to practice medical techniques, right? Because they were seen as less than human and therefore it was okay. If you really wanted to be properly trained, they were doing that in Paris, right? So by the 1830s, there's this medical school in Paris where they're essentially pioneering pathology, right? Studying specimens, studying samples, studying cadavers to understand the body so that they can do better medical care, right? So it is possible to get that training, and there are a few physicians in the United States at the start of the Civil War who've had that training. There are a few who were in Europe during the Crimean War with the earliest phases of the International Red Cross and saw some, military battlefield medical care. So there's a couple people who know what they're doing, but they're pushing against the tide of everyone else. Right? The other reason for why medical practitioners were so generally unskilled in this era is the Jacksonian ethos of the common man. Right? So everyone in the 1820s, 1830s is really invested in the rise of the common man, and that one of the results of that is a lot of cities and counties remove most of their licensing requirements for people to be doctors, to be coroners, right? Things where you would expect someone to have some measure of training become elected officials, and that is still the case today in a lot of the country, right? Without necessarily a requirement for any training. And that, so because it's not democratic to require someone to go to Paris if they want to be a doctor, and it's not morally appropriate to require someone to cut up a dead body, and so there's no expectation that there's training, right? The training is much more on bedside manner, which isn't a bad thing, right? Doctors could be trained on that better, perhaps. But so it's about caring for people as people and not necessarily understanding much about anything in terms of disease, right? Or the types of things they're about to see on the battlefield. So that's part of the problem at the start of the Civil War. It gets better. The answer for why amputation was so often the first step in Civil War medical treatment really has a lot more to do with the armaments, or the ammunition specifically, right? So the most common rifle bullet was something known as the Burton bullet. They're usually called mini balls for the French Claude Minié, but it's actually a variation on a mini ball. Right, so the mini ball was not a ball. In fact, it was a conical bullet, right, with ridges on it, so that when it went through the rifle, the ridges helped it get a spin, so it went much farther and was much more accurate. And because it was pointed, it penetrated much farther rather than a ball. The Burton variation on that most Civil War soldiers were firing most of the time had a hollowed out bottom, right? So that back end of the bullet that was ridged, so it spiraled, was also hollow, so it expanded. So it really grabbed the grooves on the rifle, and therefore got an even better spin and was even more accurate and more deadly. And part of why it was more deadly is the back end of it was expanding as it was going through the rifle, continued expanding as it was flying through the air. And so when it hit people, right, that velocity with which it hit, if it hit a bone, it shattered the bone. And the expanding back end of it just tore huge gaping holes in people's bodies. Right? The other thing they were doing a lot with artillery was canister, which is basically you take a metal cylinder and shove a bunch of pieces of metal in it and shoot it at people, and it explodes, and the shrapnel goes everywhere. Right? So the ammunition was much more deadly than anything people had seen before the 1840s. And typically, your only option, right, for someone with most of these wounds was they didn't have enough arm bone left to reconstruct anything. So you just take the arm off. And if they have a chest wound or a stomach wound, they're either going to die or they're going to get better. There's not much you can do for them. Right? So you just leave them and you help the men who need the amputations because at least you can try something. So that's kind of the state of Civil War medicine. There's not a lot they can do about people whose bone is just gone. Right? However, there was some stuff they could have done better that was very evident to anyone who was paying attention early in the war, like basic sanitation. It took a while to figure out that you, for example, want your latrines really far away from your drinking water. Because they didn't necessarily know that things like typhoid were carried through water. They knew people got sick, they didn't know how. Cholera, they'd figured out that cholera was spread through water because of work done in London in the 1840s. But they still didn't have a lot of the information we have about germs and disease. Right? And, you know, you've hundreds and hundreds and thousands of young men, they don't necessarily like to be told to clean up after themselves and bathe regularly. So that's part of the problem, right? In the summer of 1861, we get the creation of the U.S. Sanitary Commission. Actually, they're founded earlier. In the summer of 1861, they are officially approved by both Congress and President Lincoln to attach themselves to the Army. So this is a civilian organization that's going to attach itself to the Army to support medical care. And the official leader of the organization is Frederick Law Olmsted, the famous landscape architect of Central Park, but also Pinehurst. The actual driving forces behind it were mostly women, including Elizabeth Blackwell, who's one of the first women in the United States to get a medical degree, Clara Barton, who goes on to found the American Red Cross. They do a lot of the day-to-day fundraising and work of the organization. The Sanitary Commission is founded. Elizabeth Blackwell is really was one of these people who'd gone over and worked with Florence Nightingale during the Crimean War, and had learned about, you know, the best new practices in military health medical care, and came back and was just appalled by the lack of knowledge among most of the doctors in the U.S. Army, most of whom had not been sent to the Mexican War, so they had no on-the-ground training of what a battlefield healthcare might look like, and had been promoted purely on the basis of seniority rather than medical training. And was also, again, looking at the state of sanitation in a lot of the early camps, and they were just appalled. So they started lobbying the government. They were eventually told, sure, you can operate. And they take over things like coming in and trying to clean up the camps and trying to convince the officers in charge of the camps. And they have to kind of work person by person to keep this going. But they're also doing a lot of fundraising in the back end. So they're trying to get women's groups on the home front to stop just gathering up random supplies and sending them to the Army. Like everyone wants to send their soldier in their family a box, a jar, pair of socks, their favorite blanket, and a jar of their favorite jam. And what happens? The jar of jam gets broken, and the blanket is a moldy mess by the time it gets there. So what the Sanitary Commission does is try to create some sort of, essentially like professionalization of volunteer support for the Army, right? So let's everyone have a fundraising event, right? And they have these sanitary fairs. So instead of knitting socks and sending them to your soldiers, knit socks and sell them at the sanitary fair and send the money to the Sanitary Commission, and then we can buy boxes of socks for all the soldiers, right? We can buy the same blankets for everyone so that we know, hey, they pack up well and they're going to fit in people's bags so they can take them on the march with them, as opposed to the feather comforter that mom wants to send, right? we can buy really unglamorous things like bandages, right? So there's like this sort of teaching people of what wartime philanthropy might need to look like. That's part of what they do, and also educating the Army about good basic sanitation. Their shining moment is during the Peninsula Campaign. So 1862, in the summer, as McClellan's army has landed south of Richmond and is moving up the peninsula, they convince the quartermaster's division to give them some of those troop transport ships and turn them into hospital ships. Right? And they create hospital ships, some of which can just sort of move up and down along the river with the army for short-term medical care, and others can just take men back to Washington in a hospital ward on a ship. And everyone says, oh, this is good. And Congress actually passes legislation that they had been pushing for that expands and reorganizes the Army Medical Corps, that it puts in place basic sanitation training, basic pathology training that's taken from that Paris Medical School, that replaces people with no medical training and puts in more experienced officers in charge of the medical corps. So they have this great success, and they're very much on the ground after Antietam to try to work on replicating that. And they do, to a great extent. I mean, the scale of it is so much bigger. It's so much more dramatic. But they don't have, but they're able to put men on those hospital ships again and get them down the Potomac to their to bigger hospital installations. The other thing they do over the course of the war is do a much better job than the Army does at tracking where men are going when they're sent to hospitals. So they provide men with, there's no dog tag system yet, but they provide men with slips of cloth that they can sew into their clothes that they can put their name on so that people can be identified. Right? And then if men are conscious when they're sent off to the Army, they get their name, they get as much information as they can, and they communicate that, and they have local offices in all of the major kind of transportation hubs. So if you're told, my son is in the Army, he's been wounded, he's in a hospital, you go to the local, you get in a stagecoach, and then you get on a train maybe, and you end up in a place like Cincinnati, which you're probably going to have to go through if you're in the Midwest to get to the South. And to find out where the hospital is, you don't go to the Army. The Army's got no clue. You go to the Sanitary Commission office, and they can probably tell you which hospital your son is in and what town it's in. And if they can't tell you exactly which hospital your son is in, they can tell you where most of the men from his regiment have been sent. Like if they don't have his name, but you know his unit, they can give you the best guess as to where he's located. They create a lot of records that soldiers eventually use to get their pensions after the war. They are involved in helping people make claims for assistance for widows' assistance, because they're keeping track of things in a way that the Army isn't always doing when it comes to wounded men sent to hospitals. So they're doing a lot of good work. They struggle to keep up with the scale in the aftermath of Antietam, and are in the spring of 1863 sort of, there's still a lot of complaints that like the specific things people send to their sons aren't getting there. And that's not their fault as much as it's the fault of the Army's moving, right? We don't always know where they're going to be, or that lovely bottle of wine you sent broke in transport, because that's just the reality of it. So they have a great deal of public trust at the time of Antietam. And because they're not perfect, and their response to Antietam is not everything everyone would hope it would be, some of that trust is lost. But they are very successful after Gettysburg as well, so that sort of revives them a little bit. And a lot of their members eventually end up helping found the American Red Cross, so their legacy lives on to some extent. In the aftermath of that legislation they pushed for in the summer of 1862, the Army Medical Corps in the United States Army does reorganize and actually becomes pretty innovative. The Confederate Army's Medical Corps also innovates quite a lot. They have to. They have nothing to start with. Their biggest problem is, well, two big problems, personnel and resources. So they are not able to sustain long-term innovation because they just don't have the manpower and they don't have the things that the U.S. Army has. But they do pioneer the pavilion-style hospital, which is this sort of, and you can make them out of tents, so you can put them up pretty quickly. Big tent poles, big canvas, but ideally they'll be more permanent. But the idea is it's very tall walls with lots of ventilation, lots of light, right? Versus older hospitals that were often, in a city. Again, if a hospital was a place for people who had no community and no resources and were not deemed important to society, hospitals were generally very dingy, poorly lit, poorly ventilated, crowded buildings in old houses in town. And so to purpose build a hospital, and they knew enough that they knew that light and air were good things for sick people, right, which was a change, right? Pre-antebellum 1830s kind of medical care said sick people should be kept as warm as possible. You don't want too much air getting to them, and keep the light really dim because it'll hurt their eyes, and it might, right? But there's the Germans and the French by the 1850s and 1860s have convinced everyone that ventilation is good for sick people, for everyone really. Part of that reorganization of the medical corps by Congress was the creation of a specialized ambulance corps. So men who are specially trained to go and gather up the wounded, to provide, immediate assistance so that they can be safely transported, and then transport them as quickly and as carefully as possible to a field hospital, right? And then from the field hospital to the pavilion hospital. The Army also, of course, Civil War also is the place where we start to see women associated with the nursing profession, right? Women had always cared for the sick in the home, but that was what they were supposed to do as wives and mothers. Professional nursing was not seen as an appropriate job for women because it would have meant touching and viewing the bodies of men to whom they were not related. Right? But the exigencies of war are such that, okay, let's let some women who are trained help in this endeavor. Right? And so Dorothea Dix is put in control of the U.S. Army nursing operation. She very famously calls for women who are between 35 and 50 and as physically plain as possible. She prefers married women or widows. She is very clear that there will be no hanky-panky. And something like 40,000 women end up in these nursing corps. And they're doing a variety of things, but part of their job is to bring the home into the hospital, right? To make it feel like your mom is there with you if she can't make it, if she can't get to you. Right? So some of them are doing hardcore medical care if that's their training or their inclination, and some of them are making sure that soldiers can send letters home, right? So that if the young man is dying, he can in fact communicate with his family, and his family can hear about how he had a religious experience on his deathbed. So the part of the role of the female nurses is to recreate some aspects of the good death, and particularly the sort of well-educated middle-class ones who could do that work. A lot of the women who come into nursing are poorer working-class women. African-American women come into nursing in a large number, relative to their portion of the population, and they're more likely to be doing the laundry and cleaning the wards, but that is also vitally important work to keeping people as healthy as possible. The new provisions from Congress authorized and medical, the new doctor put in charge of the Army Medical Corps authorized more extensive use of pathology, so collecting samples, saving cadavers, dissecting, doing autopsies, examining the people's bodies both in life and in death, so that they could better understand what was going on. And one of the things that develops from that are significant advances in the treatment of gangrene. So they were able to see how gangrene was progressing and try things that would stop it and figure out over time, right, which antiseptics worked. They didn't call them antiseptics yet. They didn't have that term, but which things you could put on an amputated limb to best protect it so that the person didn't lose more of their limb or, get an infection that poisoned their blood and then they died. So, we have this vision of Civil War medical care being especially barbaric, and it's horrific by any today's standards. Right? But I think it's important to recognize a lot of advances that happen as well because of it, right? Because of just the necessity of all this technology, of all this death, and people trying to figure out. And they're creating microscopes, and they're looking at flesh that is clearly gangrenous, and they're seeing something going on there. They don't have words for it yet. They don't know exactly what they're seeing, but they're seeing something, and they're also able to see when what they do helps stop it. Right? And so we do get some important changes in how people are treated. Right? The Civil War also dramatically increases the popularity of embalming. Right? It was not seen as a good practice. Certainly wasn't necessary. If your loved one died and you buried them the next day, why would you bother? It's very expensive. But also didn't fit within keeping of this idea that my flesh will be resurrected. Why would I want it to be full of chemicals when it is, right? Elmer Ellsworth was a young colonel from Massachusetts, and as his regiment at the beginning of the war was coming through Maryland, he saw a man taking a U.S. flag off of a municipal building, and he went up to stop him, and the man shot him, and Ellsworth died. Very famous death at the beginning of the war. Ellsworth's family decided to have him embalmed. Ellsworth laid in state at the White House, was widely visited. When the Union soldiers go into Virginia a few months later, they are talking about vengeance for Ellsworth, right? This is very well known, and it instantly popularizes embalming for people with means. Right? So this is not an army practice. This is, I am wealthy enough that I can go to the battlefield, claim the body of my son, have the embalmer, who's now on the battlefield in a cart, embalm him, have a coffin maker make a coffin, and I can take him home and I can bury him with my family so that I can continue to visit him later. Right? And there's all sorts of cartoons depicting the embalmers and the coffin makers as the vultures circling the battlefield, because there's a lot of money in this. But it also provides an opportunity for families who have the means to be able to, recreate some of that good death, right? Where at least the body is home in the family cemetery. And of course, very famously, Lincoln was embalmed after he was assassinated, laid in state in the Capitol, went on this train tour of the country, and it just becomes much more common practice, in part because so many people saw it during the Civil War. We see the United States government, not after Antietam, after Gettysburg, right, create the National Cemetery, right? Rather than take the men from the battlefield and put them in these trenches, we're going to bury them one by one in a national resting place. In the aftermath of the war, the Ladies' Memorial Associations start popping up across the South to fundraise the development of cemeteries for Confederate soldiers. Veterans organizations are really involved in these cemetery projects, but also even more so in helping men get access to pensions, in demanding government change, both at the state level and federally, to create pensions for wounded veterans, and getting local health care support, in attesting to the physical needs of wounded veterans and saying, like, yes, this person's problem 40 years later was absolutely caused by their injury at the time of the war. And both state and national governments create pension systems as well, both for the wounded, for widows. Right? So the long-term effects of caring for the dead and the wounded and their family members, right, become government responsibilities well into the 20th century. This is an image of Pavilion Hospital in Washington, D.C. at Christmas time. Right? It's again the stereograph. Right? But you can see like the quilts on the beds, and there's this attempt for not the field hospital, but the places where people stay for long term, right? To create some hominess to the environment as well. And then also the tall ceilings, all the windows. What are some other ways people coped with the scale of death? Well, one thing we see is widespread revivals in the army camps, both sides, everywhere, in the winter of 1862. So people are turning to religion to cope with the scale of death, as you might imagine. In the U.S. Army, there's much more attention paid to ensuring that all chaplain positions are filled, right? That that there is religious counsel available, that there are people on hand to assist in the burial of the dead. What's interesting is, and we've been focusing more on kind of northern public opinion in the aftermath of this. The evangelical Protestants in the North, who tended to be associated with the abolition movement, say all of this death in the summer and fall of 1862 is God punishing us for our complicitness in the national sin of slavery. Right? And that's what you hear repeatedly from the pulpit. Right? We are being chastened. God's chastening us because he loves us. He wants us to do better. And so they celebrate the Emancipation Proclamation as a sense that, okay, we are moving in the right direction. We're not there yet, but we're getting there. And so they continue to interpret each successive horrific battle as evidence that we haven't quite hit the mark in terms of what God demands of us. Right? So it's interesting that people, turn to faith in different ways. But I think they're constantly looking for that reassurance that the soldiers who died in a way that ensure they will be reunited with their family some way in the future. There's also, in the aftermath of Antietam, a resurgence of the spiritualist movement. It's the spiritualists were these people in the 1840s and 50s who were holding seances, were trying to contact the dead. And it's very popular in Europe and in the Northeast as this sort of scientific thing, as they saw it, right? That if the soul does continue, and if there is an afterlife, then we should be able to see proof of it somehow. Right? And we should be able to talk to those people somehow and contact them. So there's this attempt to sort of bridge science and faith by holding these seances. And it's also, they tend to be led by women, so there's a very sort of opportunity for women to take a role of a spiritual practice that is often denied them in most of the mainstream religions. What's interesting is that right at the start of the war in the northern states, people were like, we need to go back to the sort of more publicly, commonly, sort of the national civic religion and the more sort of mainstream Protestantism for the sake of unity. So spiritualism sort of falls by the wayside. But again, the scale of death now has people looking for answers and looking for ways to contact their dead. And so if they're not the people who maybe weren't hardcore evangelical or even weren't mainstream evangelicals, were a little more secular, who maybe had been spiritualists before, embraced evangelical Protestantism briefly at the start of the war, they're a little put off by the message they're hearing from those pulpits, and they're looking for different answers. And so we do see that movement, most famously, although not looking for battlefield dead, but most famously, Mary Todd Lincoln holds multiple seances in the White House to try to contact the spirits of her dead children. We also see much contemplation of this death in the literature of the time, in the poetry, in the music. There's lots of popular songs that are put out in the winter of 1862 about one's called The Vacant Chair. Right? There's ones about the death of the picket. All these deaths on the battlefield are prompting sort of cultural reflection as well.
Several Union generals banned the song "Weeping, Sad, and Lonely" because it was so discouraging to soldiers.
Yes, yes. Weeping, Sad, and Lonely is the refrain of a song, a very popular song called When This Cruel War Is Over. Right? But yeah, there's all sorts of, there's great music of the war as well, including all of these parlor songs. And it was, again, really common for a, reasonably prosperous middle-class family to have a parlor organ, right, that the daughters would learn to play, and then you would buy sheet music, and that's what you would do for entertainment. And a lot of the sheet music of the winter of 1862 that was put out for Christmas sales, is very connected to all of this death. So I think we are just about out of time. Did I pull this out? I think I might have. No. Sorry. I had a picture of just one of the burial details, right? And this connects as well to what we talked about with black enlistment, because a lot of the earliest soldiers brought into those black units had been black men who'd been hired by the Union Army in their burial details. So they were already connected to the Army in some way. But that's kind of what I had for you today. Are there any other questions? The families? Absolutely, yes. This was in your parlor. It was there for everyone to see. First of all, that you were wealthy enough to have that done, but also that you had other children who were no longer living, but were still very much with you. Yes. Yes, you'd pose them either by themselves. There's one picture that I thought about putting in here, but again, I was trying to avoid too many pictures of dead things, dead people. Of a young girl who is dead, posed with her parents, that they want this picture with her. So, yes, not something we would do today, but was really common at the time.
Jamie, the deaths in the war were, without a doubt, primarily young men who were in service. Was there collateral damage? Were there civilians killed?
Absolutely. We have very little sense of how many, though. So that is something that a couple historians have attempted to calculate, and our sort of standard number is roughly 600,000 soldiers dead, as many as 200,000 civilian deaths, but we just don't know. But that's a lot, right? Yeah. The latest, the most recent estimates of death are like, we could go up as high as 800,000 all told, between maybe soldier deaths we hadn't counted, hadn't included. If we include things like the executions on the Sioux Reservation, the multiple massacres of Native people in the West during the Civil War, things like that. If we broaden what we think of as Civil War dead, as well as then the possibilities, and then the questions become as well, like how many people who died of disease maybe wouldn't have died if their disease hadn't happened in the middle of, like, there's a lot of things we can't know for sure. But some historians have said we should be talking about a total death toll as high as 800,000.
Total population.
Is it 32 million? So the best estimate is that the military dead is 2% of the population at the time. Right? So imagine 2% of the population now being dead within 4 years. Right? That's the kind of scale we're thinking about.
Could you say something, please, about Julia Ward Howe's Battle Hymn of the Republic and its impact as Northern evangelicals?
Okay, so the original tune for Battle Hymn of the Republic with the Glory, Glory, Hallelujah refrain was a Methodist camp meeting song taken by Union soldiers, and on the march, they liked the refrain. They didn't like the other words in the hymn. They initially started singing John Brown's body lies a moldering in the grave, but his soul goes marching on. Julia Ward Howe thought those words were undignified and wrote this much more kind of national project, national democracy, celebrating the Union, celebrating the possibility of emancipation. Text to it. The soldiers still mostly sang the John Brown's version on the march. There's just a lot of words in the Battle Hymn of the Republic. But it absolutely was something that was widely reprinted and became something that you would have heard people singing in church. Right? And so this bleeding of nationalism and evangelicalism is definitely happening. And it helps to reinforce, as I said last time, the idea that the death of the honorable soldier justifies the cause for which he fought, right? And connecting that to the pulpit and connecting that to religion. And it's going on in the Confederacy too, right? Just different songs, sometimes not Battle of the Republic, but sometimes the same songs on both sides. Different justifications, right? But this idea that God wants us to have this fight and to win this fight is something people on both sides are hearing, right? As Lincoln said, one of us must be wrong. We both might be wrong, but God definitely can't be in favor of and against something at the same time. But it's possible that none of us have God's favor. Lincoln definitely held out that possibility. But yeah, there was a sense, right, among evangelicals singing this, particularly once emancipation was connected to the war, right? That this is in fact what God wants us to do. And the hymns help reinforce that. All right, I think we're out of time. Thank you all so much.
But there, wouldn't it be wonderful if we believed that it was God's disfavor for any war? It might not be a bad beginning. Dr. Martinez, we're always grateful, even more grateful today. Sometime in the spring.
Yes. I have a reading list that sort of cover a lot of the ideas from the last 3 weeks. If anyone wants to take one,
The next time we're together will be on the Tuesday prior to Thanksgiving. We're having the executive director of North Carolina Child. North Carolina Child is the largest lobbying outfit for children in this state. They're the people who made Medicaid possible for all of our children, and particularly with our connection with our friends down at Sycamore School. They will bring us a report card. Every county of the 100 counties gets a report card from North Carolina Child. And you will see the report card for Scotland County: medical care, education, support, and crime. A very intriguing insight into our young people. Friends, have a good lunch, go in peace, enjoy Halloween.